Today we're going to talk about Mrs. Helen Kitzmiller. She was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. She went to Ohio State University. Now I should mention that Helen Kitzmiller, her parents were born in Germany. So she was a first-generation American. Her parents came here sometime, I guess, in the late 19th century, settled in Columbus, and so she had no special background as far as family goes to get her to move up in society. But she did go to Ohio State. I think that was fairly unusual at that time. She graduated in 1910 from Ohio State, and she was Phi Beta Kappa. So I think she was an unusual woman. While there at Ohio State, she met Helen Kitzmiller, another student, very bright, brilliant in fact, also Phi Beta Kappa, and he also came from a German background, living at Groveport, a small town south of Columbus. So they both came from rather modest backgrounds, and with their education decided that they would try to make something of themselves and of the communities that they would join. Helen married Helen Kitzmiller, and the two of them, after some teaching, he went and taught in Michigan and then later at a public school in Cleveland. Then he joined B.F. Goodrich in Akron, and they sent him abroad. They sent him to England, and he was to represent them there doing marketing. So Helen, of course, went with him. And we have a photograph of her standing on the ship as they are going across. I believe it was the ship that was to take them to Europe, and they went in 1919. So right after World War I, they went, and for a year or maybe a year and a half to two, they spent time mainly living in London, and then Helen Kitzmiller somehow wrangled a position in Paris where she was able to take some kind of courses at the Sorbonne, and she took them in architecture, and while there did some measured drawings of buildings in Paris. So anyway, she brought all of this background back to America, Mr. Kitzmiller working for B.F. Goodrich, and then deciding in 1925 that he would go back to teaching. And this time he accepted a position at Western Reserve Academy in Hudson. This was 1925. So he came to Hudson. Do you know, ladies, I mean, I hate to mention this, but 1925 was also the last year that Reserve admitted women. The women who graduated in June of 25 were the last women at WRA until the 1970s. So it became an all-boys prep school. And Mrs. Kitzmiller arrived in Hudson right at the time that the transition was made. That is, the women who graduated in the class of 25 were gone, and Mr. Kitzmiller came and started to teach French and German in the fall of 25. Anyway, there is Mrs. Kitzmiller. She is a faculty wife, and at this time in the history of our school, we did not have any women teaching at the school, only in support positions. And of course, faculty wives were expected to just be nice hostesses. But Mrs. Kitzmiller was not the type that was just going to stay at home. And so she made herself known to Mr. Boothby, who saw in her, and I have to give him credit, he saw this woman can really help the school. So he made her a special assistant to the headmaster. And she had that title and that position for the next almost 30 years. So Mr. Boothby was the first of 4 headmasters under which Mrs. Kitzmiller served. Mr. Boothby wanted for the school centennial in 1926 for a little booklet to be ready to give to alumni and other interested parties. And so he got Mrs. Kitzmiller to write this book. And so he does give her credit, although she does not appear as the author. So I said, look right on the first page. It says right there, this has been prepared by Helen H. Kitzmiller of Western Reserve Academy. Her sources of material, and then he mentions what they all are. So this was the first assignment that Mrs. Kitzmiller had, and the book itself actually went through a number of editions. I handed Maura the paperback, but here is the hardbound, which also had its own cover. So Mrs. Kitzmiller, she may have just been the special assistant to the head, but she was going to tell the head what he ought to do and what the school really needed. And you know, she had some great ideas that the school adopted. So the first logo that we have comes in Mr. Boothby's regime as headmaster in the late 1920s. Who do you think is behind all of that? Of course, Mrs. Kitzmiller, the idea person. So she actually thought of a number of things. I believe that some of the things that we consider traditions at WRA were actually things that Mrs. Kitzmiller just said to the headmaster, well, now we're going to do this. And it just became part of the reserve tradition. The tradition of wearing blazers, wearing green blazers, having green ties. All of that is, I think, Mrs. Kitzmiller is the one who made it an organizational thing. Before that, it was not. She also she began the decorating of the chapel at the time of commencement, putting in bows of flowers and blossoms. She had an eye for beauty, and so she looked around the campus and tried to get the school to do things that would beautify our campus and the buildings. She was someone who just could not be ignored. She was a very creative person. She also was the one who started the view book of the school. So just as we have a website today that prospective students, we encourage them to look at, and there are various things on YouTube, that kind of thing, on Facebook. We have a presence there. But Mrs. Kitzmiller in the 1930s, she had the idea of a view book, which was a book just showing boys, since there were only boys at the school, doing different things at the school and how they were enjoying them. Just the kind of thing that we use today, exactly the same kind of thing. Boys out on the sports field, boys at the school had a farm at that time, so we had kids who were out there working with cows and working in the with timber, cutting down trees, things that we would never do or ask our kids to do today. But anyway, that was all part of the View book. And you look at those books from the 1930s, they really are attractive. So they're the sort of thing that was to encourage people to come. So anyway, she also had the idea, why don't we celebrate Founders Day? The school was founded April 26th, 1826. So she said, well, you know, late April is a good time. Why don't we set aside one day that we'll call it Founders Day? So Founders Day began in the late 20s, early 30s. I actually have a dossier on every year that we had a big Founders Day celebration. And Mrs. Kitzmiller was the one that came up with themes for the Founders Day, games outside, how to attract the alumni, all of that kind of thing. And how about this, having the Goodyear blimp land on campus, land on the campus and take students up for a ride. That happened in 1929. I have photographs of that. So why did she do? Why did that happen? Because someone on the board was with Goodyear, was an officer of Goodyear. I'm sure Mrs. Kitzmiller made a persuasive phone call and got that blimp to come to campus. So all of these things didn't just happen, but I think that Mrs. Kitzmiller was a person who loved ideas, and she loved following through on them. And one of her ideas came as a result of a visit to Columbus. Now, she had family there. Her parents continued to live there, and a sister, and of course her husband also was from the Columbus area. So they were often going down there. But anyway, she was down there one time and talked to someone who was a member of the Columbus League of Women Voters. And she came back to Hudson all fired up about, well, why couldn't we have one here in Hudson? And so this was 1938. And Ms. Helen Kitzmiller was determined to get a League of Women Voters chapter started in Hudson. I wonder who the first people would be that she would contact about membership. Of course, at that time, they were only looking for women voters. And she knew that every faculty wife at WRA was a voter. And so she immediately had a cadre of members for the League of Women Voters. So she established that, and early on, all of those other faculty women at WRA became members of the League of Women Voters. Now, I do not have a copy of the 80 years of your history, but I do believe that among the early presidents would be women who were associated with WRA. So I would like to also share with you some photographs. Mrs. Kitzmiller in her prime, along with her husband, Harrison Kitzmiller. Remember him? I did mention that he was the reason why she was here, but he did teach German and French for many a year, and I have on this side a clipping about Mr. Kitzmiller, and what was interesting was that this article from 1925 mentions about how he married Helen Haldy, who had been a classmate in high school and college, and who accompanied him on many trips to Scotland, Wales, and France where he made extensive study of the business credit systems. They also mention about Mrs. Kitzmiller going to battlefields. This would be of World War I, the battlefields in France. So here they are. This is a photograph taken, I believe, in 1954, about the time that Mr. Kitzmiller was retiring. Here we have a clipping from May of 1939 that mentions Mrs. Kitzmiller. This is from the school paper. Mrs. Kitzmiller, school historian, president of the Hudson League of Women Voters, was re-elected president for the coming year. Other officers elected who are connected with the school are Mrs. Charles T. Mears, a faculty wife, who is secretary of the League, and Miss Elizabeth Ewing, treasurer of the League, who was the school nurse. So those people early on are officers of the League. Also, I've found an early photo of Mrs. Kitzmiller, probably taken about 1925 when they first came to Hudson. On the back, I've got some photos of the house that they built in Hudson on Hudson Street, 144 Hudson. You know, Mrs. Kitzmiller designed the house, and somehow during World War II, she was able to get the house built. It was built between 42 and 44. You know, that was right at the height of World War II, and how would you even find someone to come in and be contractor for that house? Anyway, we have a number of photographs of the house actually under construction. I've included one here, and then also a house in the Columbus area, in the Columbus suburb of Bexley, that her nephew says that she designed it. It's a Bauhaus style house, and they had pictures in the Kitzmiller file. I'm not sure why they would be there if there wasn't some direct connection with them, and the nephew was certain that Mrs. Kitzmiller had in fact designed that house in Bexley. And then Mrs. Kitzmiller and Harrison sitting together at that house around the time that he was, this photo, I think, of them was taken around the time that he retired from the school in 1954. So anyway, we'll circulate those. Then I thought that it would be nice if I could find a photo of those early members of the League. Well, you know, I have a photo somewhere of Alice Monks Mears, who is mentioned as one of, she was secretary of the Hudson League. She probably was the first secretary. But here is her book, a poetry called Brief Enterprise. It won a prize here in Ohio and nationally. And anyway, it was published 1945, and Dutton published it in New York. Anyway, Alice Monks Mears, her husband taught art, and she wrote poetry. I have one photo. I couldn't find it today. I'm not sure just where it was. I thought for sure I could find it. There's only one known photo of Mrs. Mears, and that was when she was getting the award in Columbus. She and Louis Bromfield are sharing the platform as she picks up the award for poetry. So Alice Monks Mears, an early officer of the Hudson League. And then I wondered about the Elizabeth Ewing, and you know what? I was able to find one photograph of her, the first secretary of your group. She was a nurse at WRA, and here is the story about her. I'm going to circulate this a bit later. Well, I want to just mention that Mrs. Kitzmiller's big project for the town was the relief of a Dutch village named Westersuburg. And that will be the subject of that talk come October with Molly Logan at Heritage. But anyway, as a result of that, Mrs. Kitzmiller was asked to go to Holland to accept an award, actually a medal, which we will show in October. We have the medal that she won from the Dutch government. She had organized this relief project that went on for a period of about 5 years. And there is a street in Westersuburg, Holland, that is called Hudson Straat. Hudson Street. And do you know, a few years ago, I was called by a journalist there in Westersuburg, and he wanted to know, could you please give me the background on why we have a Hudson Street in Westersuburg? So her influence really was international because of this wonderful project. So she and Harrison decided they would go to Europe, where Mrs. Kitzmiller would receive the award from the Dutch government at Westersuburg. So they went in 1955. This was about a year after they had retired. They went there, and there are photographs, I think they're circulating here. There's some photographs of Mrs. Kitzmiller taken at Westersuburg in December 1955. So this was right after she had received that award. Well, she and Harrison decided that they would go to Spain early in 1956, and I think it was because a nephew or something had been at Barcelona and had written to her in a letter about how much he liked that city. And so they went to Barcelona, and you know, early in January 1956, Mrs. Kitzmiller, only 67 years of age, died suddenly. So here she had just received that wonderful award from the Dutch government, and she passed away suddenly in Europe, in Barcelona, Spain. So I'm circulating for your edification the article that appeared in the Reserve Record, "Sad News for Friends of Academy Arrives from Europe. Mrs. Kitzmiller, beloved campus figure, dies in Spain." So there is the article, and then there was a wonderful tribute to her that appeared in the Hudson paper a couple of weeks after she passed away. And that tribute was written by Eleanor Roundy, who was the first woman hired to teach at WRA in that all-boys school. Eleanor Roundy taught English for about 20 years, and she was hired by Mr. Hallowell in the late 1940s. So, of course, she knew Mrs. Kitzmiller very well, and I believe that Eleanor Roundy served as a president of the Hudson League of Women Voters. Anyway, I have her picture on one side, and then the story about Mrs. Kitzmiller on the other. And then before I close, I want to, because I think this really gives you a sense of the kind of person that she was and her attention to detail and to beauty. She wrote a letter to the headmaster. I don't know the exact year, but I think it is probably around 1950. So she writes this, it's typed. Dear John, this is John Hallowell, who is the headmaster. I stopped in to see you twice yesterday, but you were busy both times. I had noticed that the lights on the Christmas tree had been changed, and I wondered why. The campus tree was planted in 1927, and in that same year, blue lights were chosen for the tree. Now, this was a Christmas tree that was just outside the chapel door, so the main part of our campus. It was not just idle fancy that prompted the choice. I wonder who chose that, you may ask. It was done with care and thought. Blue is the color of distance. It is considered the color of quietness and peace. It has long been associated with truth and is the color in which most of the old painters have clothed the Virgin. Well, she's really pulling out the stops on this letter. I am sorry to see this changed, but if there is a general dislike of this custom of using blue lights on the Academy tree, could they not be changed to all green, all yellow, all white? Red lights on a tree neutralize the green of the branches and make them look brown and dead. To use that conglomeration of all the colors, in my opinion, robs the tree of character, cheapens it, and makes it look like any tree from a 10-cent store anywhere. Well, perhaps I'm wrong in thinking the change was made deliberately. If so, I'm sorry to have spoken so bluntly, but I still feel very strongly that changing the lights to a conglomerate sacrifices something fine for something very ordinary. Very sincerely, Helen Kitzmiller. Well, the recipient, I don't have his reply, but he wrote on this letter, that is Mr. Hallowell himself, I recognize his hand, answered in longhand, 12/14. So I don't think that letter is on file. But anyway, this one is, and I think it does give you a sense of what Mrs. Kitzmiller really was all about, and that she was not going to mince any words with anybody. And so that's why she was, I think, a very good leader for the Hudson League of Women Voters. Many of her ideas went, I told you about some of them that materialized, and a lot of them were really notable. What about caroling on the green? She started that. She had the idea that people should carry lanterns and go down to carol on the green. So that was like her idea. She also was instrumental in forming the Hudson Garden Club. In the 1930s, she had flower shows at Ellsworth Hall, and that was the genesis of the Hudson Garden Club. Mrs. Kitzmiller did a lot for the school. There is not a day that this historian does not in some way find something that Mrs. Kitzmiller did for the school that I find helpful in my work of today.